I'm Lynda Norman. I'm a watercolor artist here in the Okanagan Valley in British Columbia. I'd like to thank the Process Art Discovery audience for joining me here in my studio today as we explore birch trees in watercolor. Birch trees have such an appeal, not only to me, but to pretty much everybody that I talk to or that sees my work, and they are so fun to do. I've got some things to show you about how I put them together most of the time. I mean, it's always good to try different methods, but today we're going to look at how we can put together a scene with birch trees using masking tape as the resist. So I've mentioned before, if you've followed along, that I like to tape the edges of my paper off, just so that when you when you have a finished product, you have a bit of room for your mat to sit if you're having it matted and framed. Okay, so that gives you a nice crisp edge. It allows you to paint to that point rather than go too far where a mat will cut off some of the beauty. I always have a hard time cutting off some of the color that I've laid down when my mats are a little bit too small for the painting that I've done. Otherwise, of course, you can always get a custom mat cut. And here in Kelowna, we have some great options, and personally, Art Framer, Roger Lee at Art Framer does all my framing and my mat cutting for me. So, but I like to keep things sort of in the right perspective in terms of sizing. So once I've placed the tape around the border, I go in with more masking tape, and this is unusual for a lot of people to see black masking tape. Something that I have discovered in the last couple of years, and it's called solo tape, and it's from Michael Solovyev, who's a watercolor painter out of Eastern Canada, and it's just a lovely product. I like the black because it does give me that nice perspective. So the tape comes in 1 inch and 3/4 inch. There it is. And so I will take pieces of the tape, and if you're worried about it sticking to your paper, if you're using a softer paper, you can rub it on your clothing or on a cloth surface and then peel it off, and that takes some of the tackiness off. So to form my trees, rather than use masking fluid, which is a great product, for me not so great, because I tend to sometimes walk away from a painting and get distracted with grandkids and other things and not get back to it. And if you leave masking fluid on your paper for much more than a few days, when you try to remove it, you run the risk of taking your paper up with it. So the masking tape is a nice option. I don't burnish it down. I just lightly lay it onto the surface, and I dream up shapes of trees. Birch trees especially, are pretty fun to do because they're pretty straight for the most part, and then you can go in afterwards and add. So I've ripped the tape on both sides, which is nice for the wider tape, just so that the trees don't have a firm sort of straight solid edge. And I just like to put them randomly, and if you can see this, you can even sort of bend your tape around a little bit. This is a narrower piece of tape. I'm going to rip that as well. I try to remember when I'm putting my resist and my tapes on, the rule of thirds. So you don't want something completely dead center, so a little off to the side. So I'll usually put a grouping of tree trunks off to one side, and I'll make that a little odd angled. And then the little pieces that have sort of torn off randomly can go on because this is a very solid straight edge from the edge of the tape, I can put the tape on beside that and make that other side of the tree look a little uneven. I've got a bit of a space there. I'm not going to worry about that. It's watercolor, and we can cover that up as we go. Here again is another piece with a very straight edge. And so I'm just going to add a bit of the roughness of this piece to that straight edge. Just layer it over top a little bit. If you'd like to, you can always go in and use a couple of your small pieces that have come off to indicate some branches. Once we've got the basic design down, the background, and then take the tape off and start applying paint to the trees, you can do your finer branches with a nice fine-tipped brush. Some people, if you're not concerned about keeping it all watercolor, can go in with a fine-tip marker, micron pen, something like that, and draw in your fine branches. And then we're just going to throw in a couple of shorter, random, bendy trees. And then I think what I'd like to do is on this side, I'll put that up a little higher because maybe that's up on a bank. And, oops. Make that tree a little bit thicker. So basically it's like painting with masking tape. You're just making your design. You can follow along with a photograph if you've got one on hand that you'd like to mimic. That's perfectly fine as well. And again, just I see I've got a stumpy end on this tree. I'm just going to take a little bit of that off, and that's going to be just fine that way. And then a couple of little branches. So basically just form a rough idea of where your trees are going to go. Trees are fun to do because they're beautiful, they're natural, no two are the same, and you can make up any kind of shape you want, and they still look like trees. So you can have a lot of fun with that. And we'll do maybe this. This will have kind of a funny stump coming out of it. That's it. That's my resist. Now, if I was to walk away from this for a month, I might have trouble pulling my tape off. So you don't want to leave it for too long. But because it's such a nice, quick process, it's easy to do in a short time. So I'm going to just move these out of the way. Now, I have painted with this palette for a little while now, and I absolutely love it. It's got room for my big brushes that I like to use, and today I'm going to bring these out. These again are from Michael Solovyev's Watercolor Online Studio. Great brushes. If you've followed me at all, you know that these are the brushes that I tend to paint with. I like them to be nice and big. I can get lots of juicy paint in these brushes and apply it quickly, which is kind of my style. I don't have a lot of time to spend in my studio sometimes, so a nice quick process is appealing to me. And then for my finer lines, I will use the Levinson brush that is my all-time absolute favorite, and we'll get to that in a few moments. I like to paint wet on wet for the most part. So that means having your surface wet, your paper. And what I'm using today for paper is Birch And it's on a block, which means it's glued on all sides except for one little tiny spot there that you can insert a palette knife or something into and slide it gently around. And if we get to that point today, I will certainly show you again how that works. So wet on wet. A nice wide brush. I mean, you can get wider brushes if you're painting on bigger surfaces. Watercolor brushes come in all shapes and sizes and forms. What I look for in a brush is something that will hold lots and lots of water. When I'm getting my surface ready and I'm getting it wet, I want something that's going to be able to cover my surface, give me lots and lots of moisture for my paints to work in. I use 100% cotton paper, which is the Arch standard. 140 pound, 100% cotton, really beautiful to work with. They do make a 300 pound as well, which is heavier, almost like a cardboard, and that is exceptional to work with as well. So the paint is, or pardon me, the water is going to be absorbed into the paper. You'll notice that the paper will have a bit of a wave to it as it absorbs the moisture, the water. The fibers in the cotton swell. Okay, and that's the inherent nature of the product. Because this paper is on the block, if you leave it until it's dry, it flattens out very beautifully on its own. Okay, so now that I've wetted my surface, I'm going to go in with my paint. And I've wetted my paints with my trusty mister, and I will wet them again. I always tell students when I'm working with them is that when you think your palette, your paints are wet enough, spray them again. You want your paint nice and juicy, nice and rich. You want it to be able to be present to work with the water on the surface. Now I can see here, and I don't know if you can notice that from the angle you're seeing this, but some of the tape wasn't pushed down, and that's fine. The way we're going to address the trees later, that's not going to matter one bit. Okay? So don't be too particular. Get that tape down, get your water down, let it sit for a moment, and if you tip your page, you'll be able to see where the area, losing a brush hair here, where the areas may not be quite as wet. Okay. Now at this point, I generally don't know, or haven't given a lot of thought to much other than my trees. Now I can decide, because I don't sketch ahead of time, now I can decide how I want this to look. Do I want there to be a meadow? Do I want this to be a little creek running through with some mountains in the background? What's that going to look like? Sometimes I just let the paints decide. There's enough water and moisture on this. Once I start putting pigment on, they will sort of move of their own volition. I like to start from the sky and work down. Skies to me are key in a painting. And I love to get moody skies and different colors working in, put some clouds in, move things around. So a lot of people use cerulean blue or lighter shades for their skies. I'm a more moody sky person, so I tend to use colors like a Mayan dark blue or perhaps an indigo. That's entirely up to you. It's your sky, it's your painting, it can be whatever you want. I start with a bit of yellow. And that was a bit of a bright color. I'm going to start with quinacridone gold. And again, if you know me, you know this is one of my absolute favorites. And I'm just going to put a little bit of this at an angle coming through my painting. Again, it doesn't have to be specific. I do want to keep my lines going horizontal though. Landscapes tend to be that way. I'm not going to overwork. And again, I just see that I like to have a little puddle of moisture sitting on top of my paints in my palette. That way a light touch. I don't need to work and fill my brush. A light touch is all I need. This brush right now is so filled, you can see it's ready to drip. And a light touch is all you need. And look at the luscious color that comes out of that. Absolutely beautiful. And I will bring that all the way down and maybe even run it a little bit up into what's going to be my sky. I'm going to try to keep in mind, again, the rule of thirds going up my page as well. So I don't really want my horizon line to be dead center. So I'm going to keep that probably the lower part. So I can fill the top of my painting with maybe some beautiful mountains and some sky. You can see, probably, I hope, that there's still some sheen to this. There's still water on the page. I can add a bit more if I feel it's getting dry. And it's nice to check. You don't want the water running off or pooling. If it does, if you find you've got a little bit too much water on your page, just take your paper towel or your cloth or whatever you're using and just touch. You can tip your page a tiny bit, and if it starts to pool, you can just lift it off. Okay? So I'm going to go in with my Mayan dark blue. And again, I'm just going to fill this space with some and I didn't have quite enough of the Mayan dark blue, so I'm going to take a bit of indigo. The indigo is really, really a dark color, but that's okay. We can. Oh, I didn't want to do that. That was a phthalo blue green shade, not one of my favorites, but it's just not in the palette for this painting. Okay, and again I can see that my paint is drying out. Watercolors, a lot of people like to do watercolors plein air. I just find outdoors sometimes, because I use a lot of water, it's important to really keep an eye on what that water level is. So I kind of like how this moody sky is coming along, and I'm just going to put some darker colors down here. I can do that near the bottom of my trees because there's going to be some shadows in there, and we can lift some of this off in a bit. Okay. Paper towels are the next thing to consider. There's so many on the market. Some of them have designs imprinted in them. So if you're pressing hard, you'll get some of that happening, some of that design happening on your surface. I like to soften my towel a little bit, but just by crushing it, and then giving it a sort of a rounded look. And then I will move it as I go, scrunching it in my hand. And I'm just dreaming up shapes of clouds. Because I've got paint on there, I'm going to have to turn it. Just a light touch. And follow a little bit of maybe where your colors on your page are. If you can see where your paint line has ended with your brush, you can soften those edges and get some cloud effects in there. You can rub sideways a little bit with your paper towel, pretending it's kind of like a brush. Again, always try to remember to get a clean, smooth surface for your clouds. Because the page is wet still, things are going to move and they're going to soften on the edges. So I'm not going to worry about getting things too specific. It's going to change, and it's going to become its own design in a very short time. So I just like to manipulate a tiny bit and make it look like there's a bit of shadow and things happening around the clouds. Okay. put that aside because there's nothing worse than using a paper towel with the color on it and when you're not expecting it and getting a blotch of color. So just kind of the way things are happening here on the page, I think I'm going to make this with a water scene. And I've got a bit of a sunrise or a sunset happening there. And I can almost see where there could be a shoreline or the bottom of some hills in that little line there. I don't know if you can see that. So I'm going to go in with a little bit of green, and I'm just going to define that a little bit. Green straight from the palette isn't always what we want to see. So you can mix some greens. This is a sap green. And I'm going to mix it with a little bit of that phthalo green just to brighten it up a tiny bit. And then I'm going to mix in a little bit of a Payne's gray. So that's going to give me a very, very dark green. And when I make my mountains, I'm going to not be very specific. I don't need to be. I just need to get the shapes in there for now. And then we can add a little bit of a shoreline, unevenness. And then down here, we will put in some shrubbery and some rocks and some different things and make that happen. Now I see where I've spattered a tiny little bit of green. And I can remedy that just by a little bit of water on my paper towel and just lightly picking that off. A light touch. Watercolor is, as much as these colors are bold and beautiful, watercolor is really quite delicate. Now that I've got this damp towel, I can still go in and add some softness to some of those cloud shapes. Some of them are going to be covered up with branches from the tree, so I'm not going to be too concerned about that. And if I notice that there's any pooling or hard edges happening, some blossoms happening because of the water on the page, I can go in and just sort of feather that away a little bit as well. Barely touching the paper, just lifting out as little as possible. I like to have it look organic. I like the shapes to be flowing and I think that's very conducive to watercolor. A little bit of shadow in there, and so now I'm just going to switch brushes for a moment, and this is my medium goat synthetic blend from Levinson, one of my favorites. And I'm just going to go in. Again, I can see that my paint is not quite as juicy as I'd like. Just very fine tip. And I'm just going to put the indication of maybe a couple of trees poking up in the background and in that on that forested hillside in the back. These pine trees, cedar trees, whatever we see a lot of in our forests here are easy to paint if you're, especially on a wet surface or a damp surface, and you've got a juicy bit of paint on your brush, because the paint will just flow and take the shape of some of those trees. Because this is watercolor, it will dry lighter, and so we can see where also, if you get a bit of extra water on your page, just the tip of your paper towel, and just just barely touch it, and it will drink up that water on your surface so that you're not blotting and spreading things out. Okay. So we're just going to continue along this forested line. There's a bit of water there. It's going to take things a little bit further. And just the hint of a bit of a forest in the background. Now that's kind of as much as we need there, I think. If you think that your that your work is showing a little bit too dark, again, just take your paper towel and dab off some of that color. You can also use, because this is more of a solid green, I'll show you in a moment. I'm just going to put a couple more trees here on this side. And you'll notice I'm just barely touching my palette. Because that paint is so lovely and juicy, it's easy to pick up. I don't have to fill my brush by scrubbing it and rubbing it. And we'll just put a couple of indications of trees here happening. While I've got this blue on my brush, I'm just going to take that and I'm just going to throw in a little bit on this hillside. Then I'm going to go back to one of my wider brushes, dampen it, dry it slightly, pick up a bit of the gold, and I'm just going to lay just a tiny bit in here and there as for highlights. You can use quinacridone gold, which is beautiful, granulating. It has a quality where it pushes the other colors sort of out of the way. So it gives a very organic, beautiful look as we go along. I see I'm dropping paint or water on my... If you do that, if you drop a bit of water and it pulls away your paint, you can always just go back in and just touch that up a tiny bit. There we go. So now that I've got some nice rich green and some dark indigo color in that mountainside and some gold, back to my paper towel, and I'm just randomly going to dab, just hit and miss, and what that does is it gives you some light play. And you can see where the other colors become shadows. Okay. All right. So we've masked off our trees, we've got some background happening. Now I can start looking at the scene and deciding where I want to shape things a little bit. We're going to get to our trees in just a moment. I'm just going to dab off some of the water that's sitting on top of the masking tape rather. It's just not necessary that it's there. Before we get into the trees, I just want to shape my background just slightly. And one of the fun things about watercolor is that you can lift off paint and shape things as you go. So what I'm seeing here is that I want this area to sort of have a bit of an inlet, I suppose you'd call it. So I want the water to be flowing back in that direction. I've decided it's going to be water. And you can see how just with a damp brush, it's called a thirsty brush. And so damp, dry, pull away, and you can pull your color out, and you still have a bit of color in the background to give you that bit of shading effect. And again, I can work on the other side doing the same thing just to get some shoreline areas in there. A little bit later on, I can take another brush, something a little firmer. This is actually an acrylic brush, very stiff bristles, easy for putting acrylic paint on. What I like this for is, again, as a damp, thirsty brush, I can go in and be very precise and specific as to where I'm putting in my lines for my shorelines. Okay. So if I've decided that this is the direction I want to go, then I can just keep on manipulating and maneuvering and changing those things out. And you can do this once your paint is dry even. So now I've got that beautiful quinacridone gold underneath. That'll come through. That'll give me my highlights and my lights. I've got some rich darks happening. A little bit of the sky reflecting into this water area. And we're just going to pull a little bit of that in. The water that pooled on this tree kind of blossomed out there into the water area. So I'm just going to fill that in a tiny bit. All right. Most of this now is fine-tuning. Anything that I want to have overall, that I don't want to be moving the paint once on my trees once I get it on the trees, I can put in now. Okay. For the bushes that I want to put on the bottom of my trees, I've decided that's what I want to do with this. I'm okay with having that overlap the base of the trees because that's how bushes grow. But in this area here, that's going to be in the background. So I'm going to do that now so that I don't interfere later on with moving the color around in my trees. So very similar to what I did in these background areas on my mountains in that area. Whoops. I'm going to do the same thing. So some nice dark colors. And I don't mind coming up a little bit into that watered area in the back. That kind of gives it some texture and some interest. And we'll bring that out a tiny bit there maybe. Like I say, it's watercolor for me is so forgiving, but it's also very driving. It can take things to another part of the design that you hadn't thought of before. So my three favorite colors to combine with this palette are the nice undersea green, and I will just dab it just randomly because this is going to give me some shadow. So I've got Mayan dark blue, undersea green, and then back to some nice juicy quinacridone gold. And when you're painting this in front of you, you will see how the quinacridone gold really just pushes the other colors away. Here's where you can decide also if you would like to add in a bit of, maybe we'll try a little bit of purple and just bring in some of that. Back to the paper towel. And we're taking off a lot of the pigment, but we're leaving a nice effect behind. Okay. A little bit of water just to make the paint a little juicier. These brushes are great because you can twist them at different angles and they will give you nice organic shapes. Now, because I've been able to pull away a little bit of that blue, I'm just going to go back in with a bit more of the gold. for a few more highlights. And that's going to give me a nice bit of background shrubbery. Okay. And I might do the same over on this side a little bit. I will put a little bit of the green in. It's a bit wet. I'm just going to take some of that off. And a little bit of Payne's Gray or neutral tint even will work. And if you don't have undersea green, a little bit of sap green, and that will give you some nice rich, you can go in afterwards with highlights. And what I want to do here is just sort of give an idea of some background. This, as I say, will dry a little bit lighter. So this is going to give me the look that, that there's a bit of branches with some greenery on them coming up from behind. Okay. And again, I'm just getting the color on there. It doesn't matter at this point where it goes or what it looks like, as long as it's in that general area. A little bit of the gold here and there, just random. That quinacridone gold, as I say, is going to push your other colors away a little bit. Give them some space. Because this undergrowth is kind of in shadow, we're good with these nice dark colors. We can brighten things up a little bit later if we need to. So this brings us to the end of part one. We've masked out our trees, we've come up with a design, we've let the watercolor sort of tell us what we want to end up with. Here we're going to have a little bit of a water scene in front of some mountains and some nice beautiful clouds, and the next step will be to let the paper dry so we can remove our masking tape. So join us for part two. Thanks to the Process Art Discovery audience for following along today. If you'd like to learn more, subscribe to the channel.